Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, September 7th, 2020. And every week or two lately, I've been doing an episode where I take a section of our annual State of the Nullification Movement report, which you can get over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, to give you an overview of how our strategy to undermine and nullify unconstitutional federal programs are going for one specific issue. I've done two so far, one on ending the Fed from the bottom up and one on nullifying the unconstitutional FDA. And on today's episode, I've got a status report on ending civil asset forfeiture in the states with a primary focus on opting out of the federal equitable sharing program. First of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is where you can get everything you need to follow this show. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. It's pretty long, but pretty easy to remember. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's where you're going to find all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on Facebook, DLive, YouTube, Twitch, and Periscope. We have archive video versions at Library, LBRY, library.tv, which is an awesome platform, Brighteon, BitChute, and BitTube.tv. We have audio-only podcast editions, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and elsewhere. You can find all that, all the episodes we've done. On individual episodes, I include a ton of links and references for you to read and learn more on your own time. And of course, you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work and help us continue to reach more and more people with a message of the Constitution and liberty. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And let's take a quick look over in the live chat. I'm using a new way to connect to the live stream. So hopefully everything is working well. If not, we're going to have all the archive versions. You'll be able to find that a little bit later on. But it looks like people are joining us over on YouTube, Facebook, and elsewhere. Quick hello. MRGF78. Tyler B says it seems fine. That's great. Awesome. Dan Warsaw, good to see you. Good morning to everyone. Larry Clark, good day to all. Gene Davidson thinks I'm nuts. Well, I think maybe it's nuts to support the largest government, the largest empire in the history of the world with your money, your votes, your support, whatever. I think that is absolutely insane. And when you choose either political party, the thing never goes anywhere different. It continues to get larger and more invasive, more surveillance, more gun control, more all of it. And asset forfeiture is a serious part of the problem. Hi to Jake Straight, who says, I thought asset forfeiture was dead in Mississippi. And we'll take a look at it a little bit more here. Kyle Reese says, looks good. Democracy is mob rule, without a doubt. Let's get right to this. And I will check more of the comments a little bit later on. Maybe if I have a chance during the show, I'll try to answer some questions live. Otherwise, I will review them a little bit later today and reply to as many as possible. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. So getting right to this, we just published the status report update from Mike Meharry this morning. Status report taking on civil asset forfeiture, which will be linked in the show notes. He says it this way: civil asset forfeiture is nothing more than legalized, institutionalized, government-sanctioned theft. We could call it highway robbery. I talked about in a recent episode how government, like Lysander Spooner warned us over a century ago, acts like a highway robber and stands on the side of the road taking your stuff under the threat of force. They certainly do that, and they pad their budgets with this type of cash grab as well. And Mike gives an interesting overview of the process. He says, when prosecutors initiate a civil asset forfeiture case, property owners must prove the property wasn't involved in criminal activity. This flips due process on its head, forcing the owner to establish the property's innocence. And he puts innocence in scare quotes because it's absurd to say that property is guilty or innocent of anything, but in essence, they're really charging the property with action in criminal activity, and then they just take it, and you have to prove things otherwise. He says this shifts the burden of proof from the state to the citizen. And if you think about what the founders and the ratifying convention, the people of the several states who were considering the Constitution, no one ever discussed giving the federal government, or the state governments for that matter in their own state constitutions, this type of power, especially to the level that we see it today, to the tunes of billions and billions of dollars. We know it's been billions of dollars just at airports over one segment, and it's way more than that across the board. Mike goes on, he says, police departments often get a cut. They get a direct cut of the asset forfeiture proceeds. And in that previous episode, I pointed out how Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico, Albuquerque specifically, was including it in a line item budget for the city, like expecting to take 1,200 cars, sell off like 650. And so this really created a quota situation where government was really pressured to steal more stuff in order to pay their bills. They go on, or Mike goes on, he says, in some cases, they keep 100% of the haul. Not all of them. He says, this has led many to dub the process policing for profit. I think that phrase was popularized by the great organization Institute for Justice. That's IJ.org. We get a lot of our research right from there. I guess it's a semi-annual report or every couple of years, something like that. IJ.org, where they give a grade on each state, talking about both the state and federal programs. And I covered an overview of what those two programs are in a previous episode last summer, asset forfeiture, theft, an overview of the state and federal programs. I want you guys to understand how the whole process works. I'm not going to get into all those details in this episode, but I will link to that in the show notes, and I encourage you, even if you've already checked that episode out, to listen to it again so you have a good understanding of how the state program works and then how the federal equitable sharing program works. And Mike covers equitable sharing here a little bit. He says, it incentivizes prosecutors on a state or a local level to bypass more stringent state forfeiture laws by passing cases off to the federal government. We've seen in recent years, some states have taken really good steps to restrict civil asset forfeiture on a state and local level. But the civil asset forfeiture doesn't stop because of the federal equitable sharing program. And Mike describes it this way. He says, through a process known as adoption, the federal government prosecutes the forfeiture case under federal law and then splits the proceeds with the local police. Through this program, state and local law enforcement agencies receive up to 80% of the take. So just to quick summarize that one more time, because it's so important to understand how this process goes, because a lot of people, it's hard to kind of follow the process when you've got these two different programs at the same time. So when a state says, we're going to stop doing civil asset forfeiture, and then it still happens, how is that? Are they just violating the state law? Well, on one hand, yes, they certainly are. But what they're doing is they're acting as federal agents. And I covered in an episode a while back, I wish I had a link because I just thought of it, the top 5 problems or top things that lead to the federal or nationalized police state. And one of them is federal, state, local, or joint task forces. And almost every law enforcement agency in the country has a memorandum of understanding, MOU, or a memorandum of agreement, MOA, with some federal agency. Oftentimes, it's the DHS or FBI or the Department of Justice or the ATF, which shouldn't exist either. And they have an agreement to help enforce federal programs or participate in a terrorism task force, a joint terrorism task force or a drug interdiction task force. And when they do that, they are essentially being deputized. They are acting as federal agents. They're allowing the federal government to get away with enforcing more stuff than it has the capacity to do by working on the clock for the state, but acting as federal agents. And then they are outside of state law. They're no longer state cops or local cops. They're really federal agents. And so therefore, all they do is partner with the federal government. They continue to do the forfeiture process. And as Mike described in his article, which I hope you will read, then they get up to about 80% of the take, even though they're told they're not allowed to under state law. It's a really, really dangerous, dangerous thing. Going a little bit further, he says, in 2018, the federal government distributed over $400 million to state and local law enforcement agencies through this equitable sharing program. That was up from $295 million the previous year. I don't know the overall long-term trend. My assumption is that it is going up and up and up, but I've pinged Mike Meharry on this to see if he can dig into the details a little further. Maybe we'll do a follow-up article to see which direction it's going. Now, if it was just a peak in 2018, but in the past it's been $700 million, then in the long term, things are moving in a better direction. I cannot imagine that being the case, but we're going to dig into those numbers and see where that goes in the near future. Now, one place where that whole equitable sharing thing, even though the state had a restriction on it, was a huge problem, was right here in California. I know you're not going to be surprised at this. Well, you won't be surprised at the first part, but you might be surprised at part 2 of this story. Part 1 is that California, and again, this might be surprising to a lot of people too, California has had some of the strongest restrictions on civil asset forfeiture in the country. It was one of the earliest states to do this, say, we're not going to have civil asset forfeiture. They did leave a little kind of wiggle room, and every time you leave a little wiggle room, they go a long way, but it made it very difficult for them to do things. So what was the result? Law enforcement agencies around the country or around the state for quite a long time, when they knew they wanted to take someone's property, cash, boats, cars, computers, homes, whatever. Most forfeiture proceedings are for small amounts, and they're for people against people who can't afford to go through the expensive process to deal with it. So it is a really egregious program. What did California law enforcement do around the state? Oh, well, we're restricted from doing it on state level. This looks like a federal case. It's a drug case, and drugs are illegal under the Controlled Substances Act of the 1970s. And so, therefore, we better call our federal partners in the Department of Justice, the DEA, etc., and we're going to let them know that we found a federal case. And therefore, we are now part of a federal task force, and we are prosecuting this case under federal equitable sharing laws, and we're going to get the money anyways. And in fact, Mike points that out. He says, until a few years ago, California was a prime example of how equitable sharing undermines state-level restrictions on civil asset forfeiture. The state, he writes, has some of the strongest restrictions in the country, but state and local police were circumventing the state process by passing cases to the feds and accessing the equitable sharing program. And that horrible monster, Jeff Sessions, when he was AG, really pushed this program on the states. He really wanted them to utilize it heavily. And there's probably no difference under the current guy who's just terrible on this stuff. And the previous one, they're all bad. But according to a report by Institute for Justice, their Policing for Profit report, he said California ranked as the worst offender of all states in the country utilizing this equitable sharing program between 2000 and 2013. So almost 15 years, they were restricted from using state-level asset forfeiture in almost every situation. And they pretty much stopped doing it in most situations because they had access to this treasure trove by acting as federal agents, which I think is even doubly dangerous, because they're no longer restricted on surveillance, warrant requirements, and things like that, too. They're just following what the feds do, and the feds are oftentimes far less restrictive than what the requirements are on the state level. So a lot of times when your local government agents act really badly, it's because they're acting as federal agents and they're not following the state constitution, and they're not following state court precedent. They're taking a new job. So for 13 years, they were ripping people off under this program, doing an end run around something that restricted them. And there were some calls to actually do something about this. And finally, I think it was in 2016, there was a piece of legislation, I think it was SB 42 was passed, and it restricted a vast majority of the federal equitable sharing program. It opted the state out of between 60 and 80% of that program. It should be 100%, but I would say from being the worst in the country for 13 years on utilizing that program to cutting it back by at least a half, we'll just be conservative about that and say it's cut by half, that's actually a pretty big deal. Now from there, Colorado followed the lead of California. I think that's probably the part 2 that is kind of surprising, that California actually took this big step to say, we're going to stop this, because the state legislature is pretty bad. They like ripping people off, and they like working with the police unions to help rip people off, just like happens in every single state. So it is kind of surprising that this passed. It was over significant opposition by police lobby groups, police unions. They just did it anyways. I think there was a lot of just public pressure. And that tells you that spineless politicians can actually be more helpful than politicians who have bad principles and good backbone. That's because they'll just go whatever way the wind goes. And as long as the market, if the people actually start talking about liberty, then they will go whatever needs to be popular so they can have their continued job of trying to control everyone else. Anyway, that's a side note, and I think another episode that might be interesting. So Colorado opted out of 85%. They actually did a study before the legislation was introduced in Colorado for the 2017 legislation. But they actually did a study, the Colorado League of Counties, or maybe the League of Cities, something like that, and they found that ending the equitable sharing program would cut about 85% of the take that they had been getting under this. So they dropped about 85% in 2017. We found a number of other states that have been doing this in recent years. So this is the big update that I think is really important. There's a long, long way to go. Most states have not taken this action to opt out of the federal program, but we've got California taking a big step. We need to follow that up and really close the rest of that loophole. California, then Colorado. We also have Nebraska, New Mexico, Ohio, Arkansas, Utah, and Arizona. They've all had similar reforms that opted out of between 60 and 90% of the federal equitable sharing program. And Mike writes, in 2018, Wisconsin also took a small step towards disincentivizing equitable sharing by prohibiting law enforcement agencies from collecting equitable sharing money unless there's a federal or state criminal conviction on the crime that was the basis for the seizure. So in essence, I don't know if that you could call, maybe it is just a small step. I should reread Mike's article on that from a couple of years ago, because to me, when I just read that sentence, I'm thinking, okay, well, if they're only saying they're only going to allow anyone to get any of the money if there's a criminal conviction, that is a huge step forward, because the problem is that they're using civil asset forfeiture. They're not requiring a conviction. They're keeping things, they're flipping due process on its head instead of the way it should be. And then also in 2019, Michigan, North Dakota, and New Jersey also took steps to reform civil asset forfeiture on a state level. Now, generally, we find that when you try to do everything at the same time, a lot of people try to push us to get everything included in one bill, one piece of legislation on a state level. And over the last however many years, since we've been doing this in the mid-2000s, the more you try to get done in one piece of legislation, the more attack vectors it gives the statist pigs in government to say, well, we need to reform this. We need to look at the legislation of this section, the text of this, the legalese of that. And it creates a very slow process. And almost every single time you try to do too much, there's kind of a gray area of what's too much and too little. It varies based on each state. But when you try to do a lot, almost nothing ever gets passed. So what we've seen as the most effective method is a 1, a 2, or a 3-step program to deal with civil asset forfeiture. And it can go in any direction. Generally, you want to shine a light on what's going on. And New Jersey actually did that, Alabama as well. They implemented strict reporting requirements in 2019, and West Virginia did in 2020. Basically, what they're saying is, so one of the problems with the equitable sharing and the state-level civil asset forfeiture programs is that no one really knows what's going on. The information doesn't really tell people where the money is going. I noted in a previous episode that a lot of times the money goes to employees, equipment, and other. And in a place like Arizona, for example, other is the largest expense of money through the equitable sharing program and asset forfeiture in general. So when people don't even know where it is, where it's coming from, where it's going to, how they're spending it, it's much harder to get people to oppose what's going on. Unfortunately, to me, it would make sense that, like, we don't even know where this money's going. Why should we allow them to have it? Unfortunately, a lot of people are statists at heart. We're all victims of government-run schooling, even if we went to private schools. So I do feel bad for people who are in that situation. But unfortunately, we have to keep pushing, even though they're holding us back in many ways. So one thing that people are doing to open this up is to pass legislation, Alabama, New Jersey, and West Virginia in the last 2 years, to actually require strict reporting of exactly how much money they're taking in, the amounts they're taking in, the average amounts, the type of people they're taking it from, where the money is being sent. And once you can shine a light on it, the theory then goes, you can actually point this out. Maybe you can generate some outrage in the public and some pressure on some of these spineless politicians who will blow with the wind. and then get something done. We'll see how that plays out because it's really only in the first year of actually requiring this. And I'm not sure, especially with everything that's been going on in 2020, I'm not sure if any of this reporting's actually been done yet. We'll see. We'll see. But then the other step that you would take is to restrict asset forfeiture on a state level. But if you think just stopping it or ending it on a state level, unfortunately, California took this approach for quite a while. Like, this is all we need to do. We did our job, and maybe these were politicians screwing us over or lying to us or scamming us, or maybe they were just ignorant of how it was going to play out or how dangerous law enforcement was going to be by just bypassing the law that they opposed, restricting them from stealing stuff, and then just deciding to act as federal agents more and more often. So in 2019, Michigan, North Dakota, and New Jersey all reformed their asset forfeiture laws to require a conviction in most cases, but Mike points out that none of them address the federal loophole. And he makes a really important point here. Unless they pass follow-up legislation, law enforcement will be able to use equitable sharing and render these reforms significantly less effective in practice. And honestly, someone mentioned Mississippi right off the bat. I don't think the deal has been done in Mississippi. They may have a reporting requirement, but I don't think Mississippi has been restricted. I could be incorrect. I'm going to dig into that and see if I can get an answer to that a little bit later. Going further, I want to point out again, oh, here we go, that New Mexico was really the first state to do any of this. In 2015, they actually passed a law to restrict asset forfeiture on both the state level and then also opt out of the federal equitable sharing program. They're kind of a rare example of a state that has done both at the same time. But as I mentioned in an episode just recently on August 28th, this provided an opportunity, because they went really fast, it provided an opportunity for local law enforcement, Albuquerque and a few other localities in New Mexico, to look for loopholes where they continued doing the asset forfeiture, even though the state said no one was allowed to do this. They did it for as long as they could. And they finally actually withdrew from the program just recently. I urge you, that one's only like 14 minutes. That's a quick episode, but it talks about how asset forfeiture fuels police spending. But New Mexico is a cautionary tale. And Mike points out that law enforcement agencies will continue to try to work around forfeiture reforms and the sunshine and diligence required to keep them in check. So we have to stay on top of this. That's why I think the reporting requirements, even though a lot of people just say, oh, that's just government money spent on reporting. But if you don't shine a light on it, a lot of people who are just willing to turn a blind eye to it just continue doing so. And the more information that you get out, as Patrick Henry once told us, he said, you can't ever be free when the actions of your rulers are concealed from the people. I'm just summarizing. That's a paraphrase of a quote that he made out of a great speech in the Virginia Ratifying Convention in June of 1788. But he was absolutely right. The more sunshine is a great disinfectant. Not always, because generally, a lot of the people are okay with this type of thing, but the more light that we can shine on it, the more awareness, the more that we can build coalitions to stop it. And we're seeing some of that play out. I also want to point out one other episode that I encourage you to check this one out as well. Early in 2019, February of 2019, there was a case, a Timms case in the U.S. Supreme Court, and some people mistakenly believe that the Supreme Court ended civil asset forfeiture. Nothing could be further from the truth. I explain that in more detail in that episode. Asset forfeiture was not ended by the Supreme Court. Now, again, this is just a quick overview of how things are going in our work. We are kind of a supporting organization to some others that are doing the lead work on this, especially Institute for Justice. This is an overview. Let me see if I can pull up our full report here so you can see it on the screen. And we're just doing sections of our State of the Nullification Movement report, which we just released this summer in June. It's a 108-page download. It's free. It's not one of these things where you have to sign up for an email list and we are going to bombard you with a bunch of promotional garbage. You don't need to put your name in, nothing. Totally anonymous. We got a PDF version. There's a Kindle version. The formatting on the Kindle version is, it's so-so. It's not great. But the EPUB version for Apple and Android. So you can read through that. The first half of the report gives an overview in pretty good detail of the philosophical foundations, the constitutional basis, and the legal basis for this type of strategy. We're talking James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and even the anti-commandeering doctrine at the Supreme Court. And then the second half goes through a number of primary issues where we're working to put it into practice. I told you at the beginning here that we've covered sections on this show dealing with the Federal Reserve, the FDA, and now this is a third episode that we've done on it to talk about civil asset forfeiture. But we'll have more in the near future. In the coming weeks, Mike is doing single article overviews of each of these sections just to make it more easy to read, easy to share. So we've got areas on the right to keep and bear arms, surveillance, national health care, and things like that. So stay tuned to the show for this. Of course, if you're not subscribed, you'll want to smash the like button, subscribe, get notifications, all that stuff, so you're up to date on what we have going on here. Now, taking a quick look over in the live chat to see if there's any good comments. Oh, there's always tons. Here's Thomas Chase. First one I look at. Big part of the problem is that justice moves at the speed of a snail, while malfeasance moves at warp speed. That is a great way to put it. And justice oftentimes doesn't move at all. And one great example of that I've been covering quite a bit lately is qualified immunity. This notion that was created out of thin air by the federal court system and then forced through the creation of the incorporation doctrine onto all the states, that if you're a government employee, you basically are totally immune from violating people's rights to the point of murdering them. Even in situations, and I did an episode recently where there were two situations where the court specifically said, well, it's very clear that these government agents violated this person's rights, damaged their car, whatever. But because of the doctrine created by the Supreme Court that we are required to follow through the doctrine of stare decisis, that's precedent over the Constitution, they still gave immunity to the government agent anyways. Larry Clark says, I don't care what you have done. Government doesn't have the right to take your stuff. There's always people who are going to say things like that. Like, oh, well, you're a drug dealer. You're not following the law, right? But what the person, whoever Larry is responding to, is missing a very important point. There are two ways to do forfeiture. One, civil asset forfeiture, which is what I'm talking about here, which is a bulk of what's going on, where people are almost never even charged with a crime. There's no criminal charge at all, much less being convicted. Or there's criminal forfeiture. And it seems to be the right approach, the morally correct approach, to say, well, only if someone is profiting from criminal activity and it's proven they're convicted of that criminal activity, can they have that stuff taken away. If it's just on the mere suspicion, and sometimes it doesn't even rise to that level, if it's just on the mere suspicion, that is not part of the American system. Anyone who supports that, and generally it's from people who claim to be conservatives, which is just nuts, because these people are talking about limited government, and they're saying government has a Stalin-esque type of power to just take things just because they're claiming it is, without going through the court process, without convicting anybody, without a trial by jury. None of that stuff. Just government says, some government cop or some government bureaucrat says, nah, we think this was criminal activity, so we're going to keep it. We're going to sell it at auction, and then we're going to use it as part of our budget because we do this so often that we know we're going to get that kind of money. Anyways, going a little bit further. In the chat. Oh, Andrew Green, good to see you. I think I saw an email from you, or maybe it was some comments that I got to follow up on. Great episode. Oh, yeah, you had left a comment about Madison, his flip-flop, and I wanted to get back to you on that as well. I will probably pretty soon. A little bit further in the chat here, Dustin Neal says, we have a similar law here in Alaska allowing silencers. However, any cop catches you with one without a tax stamp and proper documentation, they're going to turn you over to the feds. That is I did not know about that. Dustin, if you have a chance, anytime in the next week or so, please do email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com, with some further information on that, because the problem is that they're so willing to just say, well, this is a federal law, this is a federal violation, National Firearms Act of 1934. But we see so many localities dealing with immigration, for example, by saying, we're not going to participate in the 287G program. And a lot of people on the right, or a lot of constitutionalists, a lot of conservatives, are really upset about this. But rather than learning from it and demanding that your locality stop turning people over to the federal government, literally tattletaling, destroying lives for having, well, we don't even want to call them silencers, they're sound suppressors, for having something that could protect their hearing, that's good for hunting, that's good for self-defense. for owning something rather than a criminal act. It's not a criminal act to own something. And in fact, so many of the founders told us that without property rights, liberty cannot be secure. And all of this is a total violation of property rights, whether it's the stealing of something based on the mere suspicion or just on the idea that some law can be passed criminalizing you for owning something, whether it's an assault rifle, and again, for those listening, that's in quotes because I hate that term, or if it's a plant, or if it's a sound suppressor, or anything in between. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. That's more important than anything. I hope you're having a good long weekend this week. It's Labor Day. We've got a nice quote about government wasting the labors of the people that are going to be up on our social channels a little bit later today. A great quote from Thomas Jefferson. So keep an eye out for that. I'm going to read through the comments a little bit more later today and reply to as many as possible. So please continue to do so, whether it's live or in the archive. You can help us spread the word by taking a few free and easy, simple actions. Smash the like button on whatever platform you're on. Share it, share the link, leave a comment, subscribe, get notifications. All of that stuff triggers the algorithm of the platform that you're on, and it tells it to show the program to more people. And even more than that is reviews on iTunes, Podbean, and elsewhere. Any podcast platform that allows a review, that is huge. And I'm very grateful for all the very kind and positive reviews that have been coming through on iTunes and a few others. Thank you very much for being here. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month, or if you get one of our annual memberships, we've got these, I got to figure out this whole focus thing here. 110% 10th membership cards that we send out for our annual 5-year and lifetime members. But again, monthly is just $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Thank you for all of you out there. I see a number of names that I recognize who have been supporting us, some for a very short time and some for years. So thank you, thank you, thank you. There's no way we could do this work without your support. Again, thank you for spending some of your time with me today. I hope your Monday is off to a great start, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.